So when I started working in community development in the 2000s, I had very little understanding about race and how it fundamentally shaped life and the worlds around me. Most of the work I was involved in was happening in a sort of insular theoretical universe, wholly detached from considerations of race. I mean, yes, there was an acknowledgement of racism, but issues of race more deeply felt hidden to me. I learned a timeline of policies and practices that produced racialized impacts, historic and current, but I had very little understanding about how race really worked. Nor did I fully understand the centrality of white supremacy, I think, in planning and community development theory and practice. It took me years to sort of recognize, as my friend Dr. Rashad Williams writes in an article, that from the beginning, the American planning tradition developed within the context of settler colonialism, slavery, and Black Code laws, and operated under Jim Crow, separate and unequal, white hysteria, and colorblind racism. From the outset, he goes on to say, planning has not been characterized by an inclusivist urban conversation, but an exclusive white conversation. And again, it took me forever to put all the pieces together about how the policies and practices of racial and exclusionary zoning, racial covenants, restrictive deeds, redlining, racially motivated referendums against public housing were all done focused on white interest, which to me is different than understanding racialized impacts. Understanding white interest and the way we invest in it politically, culturally, socially, economically was a very steep learning curve for me. And what was the consequence? I think I neglected the role whiteness played in shaping urban outcomes. I might have understood conditions across, say, neighborhoods in Minneapolis as unjust and unfair. I might have been able to describe how racial inequities exist everywhere. And I became very good at describing how bad it was for communities of color and why, and being able to share a long timeline of injustice in our country. But I lacked the ability to really see whiteness and white affluence and the way it shows up in our cities and neighborhoods, and of course, how it shows up in planning and community development, academia, and philanthropy. In a strange way, I think we actually have to center whiteness more, including the way in which we understand how we invest in it historically, and then over and over and over and over again today. So we can't ignore it. That's what I mean by centering it, not that we feed it. Two things that I believe deeply today. Any conversation about equitable development must also include analysis, discussion, and challenging of white advantage and all the ways we produce it, preserve it, and pander to it, and that there is no cost-free escape from a history of harm spanning generations. Another consequence, I think, early in my career from the lack of learning and exposure I had was that I operated with a very, I think, immature understanding of justice, including what justice requires and how we individually and collectively should respond to it, to respond to injustice. I think in many ways I approached my work accepting the background structure of society as given and fixed, and instead focused on alleviating the burdens of those most disadvantaged by our current arrangements. This meant leaving the rules of the game untouched and instead focusing on helping players win at a broken game. I problematized communities of color rather than the systems of injustice that produced the outcomes we see today. I operated with a sort of uninterrupted or under-interrogated status quo bias that saw communities as victims and passive beneficiaries of our good action versus powerful actors capable and interested in defining their own destinies. I worked on solutions that strive to take the world as it is and make it a little bit better, but didn't focus as much on transforming the way the world works.